Before we get going into the real work of Python, just make sure you have Python already installed if you don't already. It's very easy to download. All you have to do is go to python.org and select Downloads. Make sure you get the most recent version if you can, but in any case, make sure you get a version 3.0 or higher. This course does assume that you have at least 3.0. 3.6.5, which is the current version, is perfectly fine. And also remember that we're going to spend a lot of time in IDLE, the interactive development environment. So if you have that downloaded, you should start that. So let's look at one of the simplest Python programs imaginable. So here we have it. We have a equals 1, b equals 2, and print open paren a plus b close paren. Each of these, what looks like equations, are actually assignments. And I'm going to really emphasize how assignments in Python are a little different from assignments in other languages. But all this program does is probably what you already imagine it does. We use A as a name for 1. We use B as a name for 2. That's what assignments do. It's a single equal sign and allows us to use a variable to represent a piece of data. And finally, we say print A plus B. Well, what should it do? We told it that A is a name for 1, and we told it that B is a name for 2. So when it says A plus B, it should figure out that A is 1 and B is 2. It should add them together. It ought to get 3. And let's see if it does. So we are now going into the Python interactive development environment. So in this environment, by the way, you enter one statement at a time. We can also do scripts, and we'll do that later in the course where it does an entire program at once. But the nice thing about this environment is that it takes one statement at a time, tells you immediately if something's wrong. So let's do that. Let's say A equals 1, which again says A is a name for the number 1. We now say B equals 2. See if it likes that. That took that, no problem. And now we'll type in print, open parenthesis, A plus B, and close parenthesis. By the way, in Python 2, you don't use parentheses with the print statement. In Python 3, you do. And that's why the difference between 2.0 and 3.0 is so important. Oh, look what it did. It said print A plus B, no problem. So simplest possible Python program. It does exactly what we thought it would do. It says, I understand what A is because you told me. You told me it meant 1. I understand what B is. You told me it meant 2. Added it together. And wow, it printed 3. What a surprise. But it worked perfectly. So let's talk a little bit more about assignment. Assignment is really the basic and most important statement in Python. And you need to understand this to really do anything. It's also very important in any other language. And it looks simple, but there are some quirks here, especially if you've never programmed before. An assignment is not an equation. We'll get into something later on which is closer to an equation, but an assignment is really an action. And what it tells Python to do is, first of all, look at the thing on the right and look at every part of the thing on the right. Evaluate the whole thing, figure out what it's equal to. And it has to do that first. It then, once it's happy that it understands what that expression is on the right, it then says, oh, I can assign this to the variable name on the left. And what this will mean is that variable name becomes a name for the expression. If the variable does not exist, the assignment creates it. If it already exists, it assigns it a new value. But already, if you've come from the C world or C++ or Java, you should already see that Python is a whole new horizon. As Yoda said in The Empire Strikes Back, you must unlearn what you have learned. And what you need to learn about Python, if you have any programming background at all, is that Python does not have declarations. What you do to create a variable is you assign a value to it. It says, oh, this is a name for this value, whatever it is, and then it's happy. And now you've created the variable, and you can now use it in other assignments. So let's take a look at how that works and how it can fail. In this program, and we'll try it out in a moment, it starts out the same way, A equals 1, B equals 2, and then we say C equals A plus B. And that's fine. It totally likes that, because what Python will do is it will look at A. It says, you told me what that is. It's 1. It looks at B. You told me what that is. It's 2. Can it figure out what A plus B is? Sure. A plus B is 3. And it's satisfied that it can compute a value, and then it assigns it to another variable, which is C, and is perfectly happy. Now, before we go further, I have to point out that all these words on the right side of this slide begin with a hashtag, and this is called a comment. And I have actually 3 comments here. When Python comes across a comment, it simply ignores it. The comments are for our benefit only, to tell us what the program is doing or what it's supposed to be doing. So the actual Python code is, in this case, is on the left side of the screen. On the right side of the screen, I have comments. So don't worry about comments. It's just telling us some information about the program. And I'll have more to say about comments later. So we get down to the 4th statement, and it says D equals C plus X. Well, it understands what C is. It already figured that out. We told it was 3 because it's A plus B. And then it comes across this new variable X. Well, what's wrong with X? Well, we didn't tell it what X was. Now, remember, we don't declare X. We don't actually have formal declarations like in most programming languages. But it needs to have some value associated with X. And right now it has no value associated with X. So it says D equals C plus X. I don't know what X is. And it complains. So it raises a name error. So let's just see this in practice. All right, so we've already entered A equals 1 and B equals 2. Let's try C equals A plus B, if I can type it correctly. C equals A plus B, and it accepted it because, again, it had no problem. It said, you told me what A was, you told me what B is. I could figure out that it's 3, assign it to C, so that C now represents 3. Okay, fine. But now we say D equals C plus X. And now it has a problem. When you have entered a statement incorrectly, this creates a syntax error. And Python is not happy because it doesn't understand what you want. It will raise an error, and that will be in red when you're in the idle environment. In this case, it's called a name error. It says name X is not defined. Well, why did it say that? Well, we never told it what X was. However, this is very easy to fix. We need to tell it what X means. How do we do that? We do it with another assignment. It's as easy as can be. So we'll give X some value. Let's call it 100. Enter that in. It's happy with the assignment. So now it understands what X is because we told it. That's what assignments are for. You tell it what X means. You don't have to declare X. You just use an assignment. Now that we've done that, can we go back and say D equals C plus X? And the answer is, why, sure. No problem at all. And that's what an assignment does. It evaluates the right side if it can, and now it can because it knows what C is. C is 3. It knows what X is. X is 100 because we just told it that. It adds 3 and 100 together. I wonder what it is. Well, in idle, we can print the value of D. That's one way to get it. Or we can just enter the name D directly, and if it is a variable that's been created, it will also tell me the value that way. That's another way to get a printout. Oh, it's 103. Well, I think that's exactly what we expected. So Python is happy, we're happy, and everything works because it follows this rule that before I use a variable, I have to assign it a value, and that's the general rule. Okay, here you see that once again, we gave X the value of 100. If we do that, we can go ahead and say D equals C plus X because it can evaluate everything on the right and then assign it to D. Once again, another comment where it says hashtag problem fix. The comment is just something for our benefit. And in terms of actual programming code, Python doesn't try to execute that. It simply ignores it. So let's go back to this question of what is a variable. There's a lot of instructional video or books on Python, and what a lot of teachers will say that a variable is a named storage location. And for C or C++ or Java, that's absolutely true. It's a named storage location. It corresponds to some fixed place in memory, but it's not true at all for Python. Right now, you won't be able to see the difference, but later on, especially when we deal with strings, this is going to become critical. In Python, a variable is just a name. And that means you don't declare it, you simply assign it a value directly, and the attributes of any variable are simply the attributes of the data that it represents. So don't think that a variable is a particular place in memory. Don't think it stores a particular kind of data. It doesn't. It's just a name for any kind of data that you want it to represent. And again, this may seem trivial, but this difference will become very important later in the course. But again, remember, variable is just a name. You can think of a variable as storing information if you want, but we'll need to be careful about that later on. Now, we already know how to do assignments, right? We can say n equals 5. That means n is a name for 5. But we also like to modify data or alter data in a program, right? So you can actually produce the same effect in Python. Technically, you're not changing a value, but you are assigning a new value to the existing name. So let's see how this works in Python. If we're going to increment n, we have to have an initial value for n, right? Because otherwise, if we just try to increment n and it doesn't know what n is, it will complain. It says, you didn't tell me what n is. So you have to start off with an initial value. But you can then say n equals n plus 1. And if this were a math class and that was an equation, that would always be wrong. I mean, it would have to be wrong, right? Unless n was infinity, but let's not get into that. Remember, an assignment is an action. So what does it do? Once again, Python must be able to completely evaluate what is on the right side of an assignment. And here's what it does. It says, okay, you told me n was 5, fine. You're going to add 1 to 5. Well, you get 6. Wonderful. Now we will reassign n a new value. So the first time you assign a value to n, you're creating n. The second time you do it, you're breaking the old association and assigning a new value to it. So it should be very clear what this does. So n equals 5, that was our initial value. Then we said n equals n plus 1. We're incrementing n in effect. We do it again. When it does it again, it will take n on the right side and said that's 6. Now we're adding 1 to it again. We get 7. Once again, reassign the value, n will now be reassigned the value 7. But if you programmed in any other language, this will look very familiar. It's one of the most common operations. You keep adding a value to a variable. Now, we're going to get slightly more complicated here, but I wanted to show you about assignment operations. This is combined add and assign, or combined multiplication and assign. It turns out that to add a value to a variable and give it a new value, which is what we're doing in Python, is one of the most common things you could possibly do. It's done all the time. So the creators of Python took a shortcut from the C world and brought it into Python. And these are called combined assignment ops. If we say n plus equals expression, where expression could be anything you want, that means the same as n equals n plus expression. So if we say n plus equals 1, that means exactly the same thing as n equals n plus 1. And that operation is so common that we have these shortcut operators. Do you have to use them? No. But if you look at the code of experienced Python programmers, it will be filled with these things, so you might as well learn them now. It's just a nice shortcut for your convenience. We can do it for multiplication as well as addition and subtraction and even division. And the comments on the right side of the screen here show what each of these do. And let's go back and look at our first example, but rewrite it. So before we were saying n equals 5. Then we said n equals n plus 1, and then n equals n plus 1 again. Now we're simply replacing that by n plus equals 1. All it does is add 1 to n. It's pretty simple once you just remember what it does, and we're simply saying that n equals n plus 1 or n equals n plus whatever is so incredibly common. Python provides us this really nice shortcut. Now let's talk a little bit about variable names. Can you use any name whatsoever for a Python variable? Can you call it Fred or George or Foobar? And actually, you can. There's only few rules on this. The first character must be an underscore or a letter. The real important point here is the first character in a variable name cannot be a number. Because if the first character was a number, it would confuse it with actual numbers. So that doesn't work. Basically, your first character is going to be some letter. but the subsequent characters can contain digits if you want. So instead of N, you can have N1, N2, N3, whatever. You cannot have embedded spaces. Python would get confused. And you can't have keywords. Now, do you have to memorize a long list of keywords? Generally not. It's going to be obvious what a keyword is. If, while, def, for, and, or else. There's just a few keywords that you're going to learn, and you don't have to memorize a long list of these words. It'll be pretty obvious. And finally, names in programs, whether it's keyword or a variable name, they're all case sensitive. So remember, you can't interchange dog with capital D-O-G. Also remember comments. I touched on this. Let me say it again. A comment which begins with a hashtag, assuming it's outside a quoted string. We'll talk about that later. Anything beginning with a hashtag to the end of the line is a comment. Now, a comment is simply text ignored by Python. Well, why do we put these in our programs? We put those in our programs for our own benefit and for the benefit of other programmers. And a lot of teachers will say, well, comments improve the readability of your code. Well, sort of. Actually, a Python comment or any kind of comment, you can put any text you want. You could put Mary Had a Little Lamb or the Gettysburg Address. Wouldn't necessarily be very helpful to your program, but you can write anything you want. The truth is a comment is going to be as good as you make it. So write comments, put hashtag, tell what the program does. It's for your benefit, but put in something that would actually help you understand the program. Pretty obvious. In summary, remember that assignments are the most basic statement in Python. You're going to see a lot of them. And they create a variable. They actually create a variable. You don't declare variables. This is how you create them. This is how they come into existence. And variables are just names. The attribute of variable is simply the attribute of whatever data that it names, or it gets all its attributes from the actual data. Doesn't have its own inherent attributes. And then comments. You use them to make the program more readable, but they're only as good as the text you write.